Hi everyone, I'm Eli Lake of the Washington Times, the New Republic, and I am honored and it's my great pleasure to say I'm once again with Heather Hurlburt of the National Security Network, formerly of the NSC. How are you today, Heather?
Ice Storm Edition. I've been working up a whole riff in my mind about how working on progressive foreign policy is like standing in front of your house trying to break ice with a plastic shovel.
I thought you were going to say it's like the movie The Ice Storm. Just kidding.
My impression of the movie with the ice storm, which I've never seen, is that it had a whole lot more sex in it than progressive national security policy.
Yeah, no, it was like the cautionary tale of this is the 70s, the cautionary tale.
Right. I'm not sure anyone ended up happier, but that there was a lot more sex along the way. Anyway, this is our fabulous current events West to East edition, where we start with the revolution or not revolution in Tunisia and move rapidly eastward, uttering things that go counter to expectations all along the way. So, Tunisia, revolution or less than meets the eye?
It's too soon to. It's very much too soon to say. I mean, we've seen an effort right now to try to form a coalition government, which has been encouraged by almost all observers. But it certainly is a revolution in the sense that the dictator has been exiled. So, in that respect, I guess it's a revolution. It's not a violent revolution, or at least not terribly violent so far. And it's also not an Islamic revolution. At least it doesn't appear to be that in any sense at this point. And it may be, though, I'd like to kind of learn more about this, though I've seen some reports, the first WikiLeaks revolution.
Yeah, so I think there's a number of labels getting pasted on this,
right,
which is really interesting. I think the first thing for people to understand is the depth to which Tunisia is a one-party state, and that there was not a really well-organized political opposition leading this, so that literally you threw out the president, everyone else in line to succeed the president is from his political party and has benefited and or lived within his corrupt and autocratic rule. And the other thing you got to know about Tunisia is this is only the second president Tunisia has ever had, and he overthrew his autocratic predecessor. So there's just a profound amount of discontent that this is reflecting, which is really fascinating. But there aren't, unlike in even say Georgia or Kyrgyzstan, or even what we saw and hoped for in Iran, there aren't actually political channels for this discontent to run into, which is why what you're seeing is so unclear, and whether and what it actually turns into for Tunisians is very unclear.
Well, I just would point out, though, that I think if anything kind of comes of this, it will be a government that will be more tolerant and less intrusive on online criticism. I mean, that would appear to be one area where we'd think it looks like you would see some kind of new compact. But again, we're watching the events unfold.
Yeah. So, a point that someone else made to me today that I think is really fascinating about the Tunisian case is that it unfolded all, as far as we can tell, all on its own with no help from anybody outside. And as has been noted, the U.S. and France have been strong supporters of this autocratic government, and while the WikiLeaks and the Tunisian folks actually put up their own website to spotlight for the Tunisian public cables in which American diplomats wrote quite openly about the failings of the regime and how horrified they were by it. But nobody outside was helping this. This isn't an outside-sponsored revolution, and I think it really, we'll see where it goes. But it does really point up that ultimately it's people within a society who have to be the originators, and that you couldn't have created this from outside if you'd wanted to.
Well, I mean, I think that's true of all these kinds of people power movements, that you need to have, that they ultimately are indigenous. And somebody who at points, think that it is appropriate for the U.S. to lend robust material support to movements seeking a democratic revolution in various countries, that it's never going to be the mastermind is from outside. It's always going to be, even like the obvious example, Khomeini was living in Paris in the years before the Iranian Revolution in 1979, but even, ardent partisans of that revolution would say that it was the organization that went on the ground in Iran that made it happen. It wasn't Khomeini who was the mastermind of it, although he ended up being the figurehead. So I think that's a very valid point. I just would stress, though, that I think you look, there would be NDI and IRI, that's National Democratic Institute and International Republican Institute and National Endowment for Democracy programs that were aimed at expanding the political freedoms in Tunisia that certainly are not responsible, but I think that there are things that are ongoing commitments that are made in Western countries like that, like these kinds of programs that help nurture the people who end up organizing these kinds of things. Though I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure there must be some Tunisian programs that are done.
And actually what's really interesting is what's been done through MEPI, the Middle East Peace Initiative, and its predecessor, which, for
Liz Cheney Initiative.
But it was a new name for an initiative of a similar nature that was rolled out during the Clinton administration, which for more than 10 years now, there's been this effort to twin Arab-Israeli peace talks with a broader outreach to try to promote both social and economic change across the Arab world. And at one time, before this government was cracking down quite as much as it has in recent years, there was an enormous amount of activity in Tunisia and a lot of hope that that Tunisia would liberalize gradually and be some kind of, quote, role model, unquote. And so programs like MEPI and its predecessor actually did put a lot of effort into Tunisia, which, I think is a good example. If you try to sort through programs that go out and say, we're going to produce regime change in country X, country Y, that doesn't work and backfires on you. But when what you're trying to do is empower the civil society that's already there, then interesting things happen.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But, in certain circumstances, I've said this to you before, I thought that the support from the U.S. Embassy in Budapest in 1998, 1999, and 2000 for the Otpor movement in Serbia was a great example of nurturing. But they're the people who were involved in that program would tell you that it wasn't them; it was the brave student leaders that made that regime change in Serbia possible. It's just choosing the right people to support, I guess, and also being patient with them over administrations.
Yeah, and there's also, that's the number one. This isn't a time. You can't put a time on it. And number two, the sort of who to support is also really a problem because in the moment, ultimately, it's naive to think, and you don't need to look any further than Iraq, that the U.S. is going to be able to figure out who comes out on top in a place. And if you're not prepared for democracy in a society to spit out forces that we don't like, then you shouldn't be promoting democracy in the society. And one of the things that I think people have got to brace for in Tunisia is that one of the things the autocratic government did very well, frankly, was to keep radical Islam at bay. And so you're going to have Islamists among the people who say, hey, our rights have been violated, and now we want to go out there and organize and take our rightful place. And we're going to have to swallow hard and say, that's part of the democratic process, and we don't control it.
Well, up until 2005, Heather, people said the preventive security forces in Gaza and the West Bank have done a really good job of keeping the Islamists at bay. Until the moment they don't. And, I think in Egypt, that police state has done a wonderful and marvelous job of arbitrarily arresting lots of members of the Muslim Brotherhood and even more radical factions. And the Muslim Brotherhood itself has done a pretty good job of marginalizing these radical factions. But a lot of people look at Egypt right now and they say it looks on the facade to be very stable, but the leader is sick, and who knows what happens after Hosni Mubarak dies. And I just think that it's a way of kicking that can down the road that, harsh measures against Islamists in these societies, I think, end up creating a false choice between political Islam and dictatorship, when I think it's in the West's interest to say the real choice needs to be for, open societies, which are neither political Islam nor dictatorship. And
well, Eli, the one problem with that is it's not for the left or right or anybody else to tell Tunisians or Egyptians what the real choices are in their society. That's the lesson of all this to me. And just on Egypt,
that's not telling them what the choices are. It's just fine. All these societies have people who want an open society. There's always somebody who's pushing for it. It's just a matter of whether the West treats that person, the way, as somebody, who they see as ultimately, an ally that they want to support, or whether the West pretends that person doesn't exist and goes along with probably what the regime wants to do to that person, which is to, either keep them in jail or keep them exiled or something like that.
Right. So I think we're agreeing violently about what happens when you have an autocratic regime in power, but we're noting that when you have the hoped for democratic transformation, it doesn't always spit out the correlation of forces that one would like. And I just want to say on Egypt, because you're absolutely right that anyone who thinks Egypt is stable is fooling him or herself. One of the really tragic things that's been happening there in the last couple of days is people have been following events in Tunisia with so much excitement, and there were demonstrations at the embassy, and there have now been 3 self-immolations in Egypt in the last couple of days as people are hoping to set off something in Egypt like what the college-educated street vendor who burned himself to death did
in Alexandria
in Tunisia. So this is a really a sad commentary on just how desperate people are to figure out something that would spark meaningful change in Egypt.
When I lived in Cairo, one of the things that really does strike you is that when you live in an authoritarian society, that because there isn't as free a market and because there isn't political freedoms, that the political machine promotes a kind of mediocrity that infects all elements of the society. So the most talented people usually end up not being the people who rise to the positions of most responsibility. And they become a kind of natural constituency for an opposition if they can get things together and they're not foiled by the state and the state security apparatuses. And so my sense, and just to sort of violently agree with you again, is not to have diplomats or USAID workers come in and say, this is how you do a democratic revolution, let me give you the 5-step course. It's to say, rather, to identify those people who are this natural constituency for expanding freedom and to ask them what they need from the world's most powerful democracy.
Well, lest our listeners get too bored by watching us violently agree with each other, let's move a little further to Israel, Iran, and there have been these fascinating developments over the last week. First, a bunch of statements out of current and retired Mossad leaders saying, oh, we've got a lot more time than we thought we had with respect to the Iranian bomb. Then you have this front page story in the Times over the weekend laying out in more detail than I ever expected to see in an unclassified setting a number of allegations about how the Stuxnet virus may have been developed and how it may have worked to disable the Iranian reactors. Well, the stuff that the Times article had on how the Stuxnet targets a Siemens-made processor in industrial factories is not. It's something that's been on the internet and that people have written about. I mean, they had it solid. What was really new and spellbound and great reporting on their part. I'm kicking myself because I had parts of this, but I didn't have the whole thing. Was the reporting about how Siemens company had lent some of the P1 centrifuges that they made, or rather this control panel that they made, to an Idaho-based Department of Energy lab, which sounds, or at least did not answer the questions from the New York Times as to whether they shared their sort of testing results with the intelligence community, and then how in Dimona, the site of the Israeli nuclear reactors and the Israeli nuclear arsenal, there was also these tests on the P1 centrifuges in Israel, and how it looks like they worked on it and then sort of unleashed this thing in 2009, and then by the time the Iranians found out about it this year, it was too late. And as other Israelis have said, this computer virus, this act of, I guess you could argue, cyber war, has been more effective than a bombing campaign, which I guess, if I may instruct viewers to earlier dialogues, to even 2007 with me and Reza Aslan, I have been saying for a while that there's been, there is a kind of secret sabotage world. There's an article I wrote for the New Republic on this from July. There's a secret war against the Iranian nuclear program, which is not involving airstrikes, that appears to have been pretty effective. And Stuxnet, of course, is a big part of it, but there's other elements as well. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I found sort of fascinating and bemusing about all of this is that you had these several developments, including, as I say, somebody somewhere, which certainly looked like Israel to me, deciding that it was beneficial for the Times to know about this in some detail. And that this seemed to make the Prime Minister of Israel so anxious that he did come out with a statement a couple of days later saying, no, we still need to have a military solution on the table, which, to my eye kind of flies in the face of what had come out, both for the reasons that you say and, because frankly, we're going to have another round of talks later this week, which is unprecedented that we've actually managed to have several in a row. And last time the Iranians said, well, we'll come, but we won't talk about our nuclear program. And they came and they talked about a nuclear program. So, the bigger picture here is that there is time. There's time to work toward a diplomatic solution, and we have shown that the Western powers are capable of looking after their interests. And so the level of hysteria. What would be really nice is if this drains away some of the sort of hysterical level of angst around Iran that we've had in the past, and that we get back to regarding it as a serious security problem, but one that can be managed through a combination of the tools of statecraft without needing to attribute to the Iranians these kind of superhuman abilities that can only be dealt with militarily.
Yeah, well, we've hit the part of the dialogue where, I would say that it gives you time. I don't have any faith that the current regime in Iran is able to negotiate any kind of settlement to this problem. The Obama administration reached out its hand and toned down the rhetoric for its first year. Apparently, Ahmadinejad even wanted to kind of pursue this TRR deal where they export some of their nuclear fuel. And other elements of the regime wouldn't even let him do that. And that's not a deal that's a confidence building measure, which the Iranians haven't done. The Iranians are still in violation of their initial promises to keep the IAEA, the additional protocol of the nonproliferation treaty, which allows spot inspections of all of their facilities. There is still this kind of cat and mouse game where, most recently, about 5 or 6 months ago, the United States discovered a new facility in Qom, which had not been declared. Remember that Natanz facility, which is under monitoring right now, was not declared. So I don't think that holding out any hope for a deal, I don't think that there really is going to be a deal with this regime, but there is a serious opposition movement. So I think, if anything, it does buy time for the best possible solution, which would be the collapse of the 1979 revolution and a new Iranian regime that really would like to renounce terror and participate and be a stakeholder in the international community, and sort of get rid of the terror gang that's currently in charge of it, which, as we know, human rights disaster, second most executions of anyone except for China in the world, according to Amnesty International's report. What they did, in the months after the election was just Stalinist in terms of going after people who were trying to demonstrate against what they saw as a fixed election. And then, of course, there's support for terrorism. So there's all these things the Iranians do which are so problematic that if, you don't have to bomb them, which I think wouldn't be good for the prospects of supporting the movement against the regime, it buys time, I think, in that respect. So Eli, here's a really interesting sort of thought experiment for you. And this is very unpalatable to contemplate, but I think we've seen enough that we have to think about it seriously. So at some level, right, of all the forces in Iran, Ahmadinejad, because in some ways of the extremely unpleasant rhetoric he chooses to use, Ahmadinejad is the only one who either can or in any way might seem to want to make a deal with the U.S. And now imagine a scenario where we finally do have the successful Green Revolution and a new government comes to power, but it's rather tenuous and it's gotten to remain a hold on the, at least 30 to 40 to who knows what the real percentage is of Iranian society, which is frankly much more conservative and found the blandishments either of Ahmadinejad or of the Revolutionary Guard quite convincing. And that leader, whoever he or she is, comes to us and says, so here's the thing, guys, we can quietly cut Hezbollah loose. We can do a bunch of the things that you all want, but we absolutely cannot renounce our right to enrich. And we absolutely cannot say that we have stopped the centrifuges, because that
is letting go of the key to Iranian national greatness that our people have been sold for all these years and at all this expense. So if you in the West want our fledgling regime to survive, you're going to have to back off us on enrichment. And I think, that would be a very good case scenario, because you'd have a government that would no longer have any particular reason to use nuclear weapons, but that would be a very hard pill for those in the U.S. and in the West who have really backed themselves into a corner to swallow. So what's the way, if that's the sort of devoutly desired outcome, right? What's the way to leach the poison out of that? And one of the ways to leach the poison out of it is to now make it clear that we would do a deal with Ahmadinejad if he would do a deal with us. Not, we despise his policies on human rights. We despise what he uses Hezbollah to do. But because it's in the larger interest of everybody in the region and us, we would do a deal with him if we thought it could be verified. And that makes it easier for whatever government that would come later to deal with us as well. So actually it's, there's every strategic reason to signal that we would do a deal, and there's no reason to signal that we wouldn't.
I disagree with that. Ahmadinejad is still the putative president of, a government that, the leader of a government that the Iranian people and the Iranian opposition believe is illegitimate and was not elected. And as best as I can tell, the Iranian opposition would like the West to sort of make this point to take their side and to withdraw legitimacy. I think there are other things you can do to withdraw legitimacy from the current regime. So I think that any kind of deal that acknowledges or recognizes Ahmadinejad as the president of Iran potentially undercuts until, and they do have ways of communicating until the opposition movement says otherwise. Now, there is a school of thought that, some people like Clint Leverett say that there really never was much of an opposition and you're holding your breath for nothing and, they're vanquished. I don't think that. Maybe I'm being optimistic, but it's very difficult to know if you're not on the ground, and certainly the regime is quite brutal and terrible. But I think that that they constantly seem to want, Heather, a kind of recognition, and Ahmadinejad wants that recognition as a way to sort of turn back to his opposition and say, no, look, no one's on your side right now. Whereas I think that it's probably a smarter policy to look at ways in this window that was purchased maybe through Stuxnet and other means to figure out the best way to advantage the opposition to Ahmadinejad, and to turn that around and say, this illegitimate government is never going to be able to get the deal that they ultimately want, which is a sort of recognition of the revolution because of all the terrible things they've done to us. So I don't know if
So Eli, I just want to point out that there's a bit of a contradiction there. If you say on the one hand that there is no threat to humanity or Israel or whatever chunk of humanity you want to say as great as the threat of an Iranian nuclear weapon, and then you say, but actually we have this window and we don't need to use it to deal with the Iranian nuclear weapon. We can use it to deal with the problem of regime change in Iran. You have a little consistency.
Well, but no, I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think the problem is that the regime itself is the threat, not just to Israel, but the threat to its neighbors. It's this revolutionary regime that's the problem, and that if you let the revolutionary regime get a nuclear weapon, it's even more problematic. So. But the revolutionary regime short of a nuclear weapon, the revolutionary regime with any kind of advanced weaponry or cyber capabilities is a problem. It's the regime. It's the nature of the people who are making those decisions. It's how they view the world. And there is some evidence that there is a faction within Iran that actually seeks these kinds of confrontations. So,
Yes, but it's not the regime. Interestingly, it's the Revolutionary Guard, which is off to the other side of the regime, exerting all kinds of pressure. So you've got an extremely complex domestic situation in Iran. And, many Iran experts make a point, which I really chafed under the first couple times I heard, diverse people say it. But, that in fact, you need to let go of the idea that from the outside you can leverage your way among all of the conflicting elements that make up Iranian politics, which do proceed as politics, even though not in a democratic manner. And so if you accept that you can't actually, by your actions alone, ensure who comes out on top, then the best thing you can do is actually deal fairly and openly and make it clear that, if Ahmadinejad could get this kind of a deal from us, yes, a democratic government could get an even better deal. But it's not that, it's not that we care so little about the nuclear weapons, or that we think that we can't create a situation in which Ahmadinejad would find it to his advantage to make an agreement and stick to it. The other thing I did want to say, Eli, about windows of time is that it's useful to remember that with, say, the Libya deal, that actually had been in the works for several years before it came dramatically to fruition after the invasion of Iraq. So, on all of these things, it takes a lot more time than anybody really likes to contemplate. So, the idea that, there's only a tiny window, and if diplomacy doesn't work within that tiny window, then we've got to abandon it, that's ahistorical.
Well, I suppose that if you wanted, keep in mind, the negotiations with Libya were a massive state secret on both sides. So, if you did it in such a way that there was but every time there's a meeting, it also has the effect of legitimizing a regime that the opposition and many other observers believe stole the 2009 elections. So that's the first point I would make. But the deeper point here is that there's no reason to believe that the Iranians will keep their word. There, in fact, was a deal in 2002 that the Iranians would fess up to the Natanz facility and then allow the spot inspections and the IAEA to do their job. And, of course, they broke that deal. So there's also this question of what would a deal be worth with this particular regime? Not much. And then,
it depends if you get inspectors in or not. If you get inspectors in to know that the deal is being kept or not being kept, then it's worth something. If you get a deal that doesn't involve inspectors, you're right, it's not worth anything. So you can't sort of rule out a deal without sort of specifying what does that deal buy you.
Fair enough. If you got inspectors and you got the ability to spot inspect all the suspected facilities and so forth, but I think, if the New York Times reporting is right, and I think that you would add other things. There were lots of counter-proliferation things that trying to make sure the Iranians don't have Mirage steel, for example, trying to make sure the Iranians don't have carbon fiber and have to make it themselves, and doing other kinds of more traditional sabotage. That has purchased more time than any number of negotiations, and it has the advantage of not being used. And you have to admit that there is a propaganda victory, an important propaganda victory that the regime gets when the U.S. sits down with them and makes its demands and treats them like they're a legitimate government. Whereas I think, if you look at, the defense...
I think it's possible to overblow dramatically how much a propaganda victory that is, given that Iran is a fairly porous media society. And so the people that the regime is having trouble with understand very well what's going on and understand that the regime is saying something completely different to them about what it's doing at the talks than it's actually saying outside the country. So I think, this isn't North Korea, this isn't Burma. People, it's not the case that everybody in Iran is on Twitter, and you have a tiered society, and part of the problem, again, is that you do have a tier of people that believe implicitly everything the regime says, but they're not having a complete and total propaganda victory either.
All right. I guess I would go back to not worth the paper it's written on, at least so far. The Iranians have proven not to be trustworthy negotiators. And I think you can sort of walk and chew gum sometimes. And insofar as, if you fool the Iranians into thinking that you're soft when in fact you're doing all these covert, dirty war things against them, I guess there is a kind of deviousness to that, which is admirable. But I just don't. It's kind of going round and round and round again. And as they try to frame this as inserting their right to enrichment, but really the issue here is that they have violated the NPT on a number of occasions, and the NPT and the IAEA to date has sort of been unwilling to do everything it can to sort of speak plainly about that. And so there also is a risk here, which is that what is it that the Iranians have to do to finally kind of bear the full brunt of violating one of the most important treaties in the modern world, Heather?
Eli, that's a really bad road to go down, because I could take out Iran and put in the names of several other countries, and the answer is nothing. They'll never bear the brunt. So, yes,
so Israel has a nuclear program,
but
Israel isn't a member of the NPT, neither is India, neither is Pakistan. I mean, that's a big difference. And then, I mean, North Korea has a similar problem. That you have people, when you have member states of the NPT doing all the things that the Iranians and the North Koreans do, it weakens the NPT. It's a bad, bad thing.
And if you don't have, if the U.S. behaves in a way, as it has, that causes other NPT signatories to side with Iran.
Who's siding with Iran?
And by the way,
Eli,
when the U.S. says that Iran doesn't have the right to enrich, that is also in contravention of the NPT, and that really... that Iran, under the NPT, has the right to enrich for peaceful purposes, and when we say that it doesn't, that completely takes away our ability to make the NPT argument.
But the U.S. says the Iranians don't have the right to enrich.
By the NPT.
You don't have the right to clandestinely enrich under the NPT.
But that's not the talking point. That's a different talking point from the one that gets used. And Eli, I apologize, but as we discussed, we agreed this was going to be a lightning round, but I think we've provided enough.
Well, we should do. All right, you don't want to do anything on the tone.
Yeah. I feel like if this is an opportunity for me to abstain from discussing the tone in American politics, perhaps rather we can just congratulate ourselves. We can end with some gratuitous self-congratulation about the tone we maintain in our bilateral disagreements.
Yeah. Well, we never were the problem.
Okay, gratuitous self-congratulation here. Gratuitous congratulation to the Blogging Heads audience, and see you next time.
Okay. Bye-bye.